The vast steppes of Eurasia have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, yet few have captured the imagination, quite like the mysterious horsemen who thundered across these endless grasslands over 2 millennia ago. While the great empires of antiquity built their monuments in stone and brick, leaving behind towering ziggurats and elaborate palaces, there existed a people whose legacy was written not in architecture, but in gold, whose cities moved on wheels, and whose very way of life challenged everything the settled world thought they knew about civilization itself. These were the Scythians, a name that once struck terror into the hearts of Persian kings and earned the grudging respect of Greek philosophers. Yet for all their fame in the ancient world, the Scythians remained an enigma wrapped in myth and legend. No libraries preserved their written chronicles, no scribes recorded their laws in cuneiform tablets, and no royal inscriptions boast of their conquests in stone. Instead, their story emerges from the earth itself, told through elaborate burial mounds scattered across the steppes, through exquisite golden artifacts that speak of unimaginable wealth, and through the accounts of their settled neighbours who alternately feared and admired these nomadic warriors. The Scythians were not merely another barbarian tribe raiding the edges of civilization. They were the creators of a sophisticated culture that spanned continents, master craftsmen who produced some of the finest metalwork the ancient world had ever seen, and military innovators whose tactics would be studied and copied by conquerors from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan. Their influence stretched from the shores of the Black Sea to the borders of China, creating a vast network of related peoples who shared similar customs, artistic styles, and ways of war. What makes the Scythians particularly fascinating is how they confounded the expectations of their contemporaries. To the Greeks, who prided themselves on their civilization and looked down upon all non-Greeks as barbarians, the Scythed Etrublians presenting paradox. Here were people who lived in wagons rather than cities, who followed their herds rather than tilling fields, yet who possessed wealth that rivaled any kingdom and artistic achievements that left even Greek artisans in awe. The very existence of the Scythians forced the ancient world to reconsider what it meant to be civilized. The story of the Scythians begins not in the steppes they would come to dominate, but in the mountains and valleys of Central Asia, in regions that today lie within the borders of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and southern Siberia. During the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, these Eastern Iranian peoples began one of the great migrations of antiquity, moving westward across the vast expanse of the Eurasian steppe in search of new pastures and new opportunities. This migration was not a sudden exodus, but rather a gradual movement of tribes and clans, each following their herds in the eternal search for fresh grazing lands that defined the nomadic way of life. The reasons for this westward movement remain debated among scholars, but climate change, population pressure, and conflicts with neighbouring peoples all likely played their part in setting these horsemen in motion across the steppes. As the Scythians moved westward, they encountered and displaced other peoples who had previously dominated these regions. The Agathyrsi and the Cimmerians, themselves formidable warrior peoples, found themselves overwhelmed by the newcomers. The Cimmerians, in particular, had been a major power in the region, but the arrival of the Scythians marked the end of their dominance. Some Cimmerian groups were absorbed into Scythian society, while others were driven further west, where they would continue to raid the borders of the Assyrian Empire and the Greek world. By the 8th century before the Common Era, the Scythians had established themselves as the dominant force on the western Eurasian steppe. Their new homeland stretched across the vast grasslands that extended from the modern borders of Kazakhstan in the east to the Danube River in the west-west, encompassing much of what is now Ukraine and the southern Russia. This territory, which the Greeks would come to know as Scythia, was perfectly suited to their way of life. The Pontic steppe, as this region is known to modern scholars, offered everything a nomadic people could desire. Vast expanses of grassland provided endless pasture for their herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. Rivers like the Dnieper, the Don, and the Volga offered water and served as natural boundaries between different tribal territories. The proximity to the Black Sea opened up opportunities for trade with the Greek colonies that were beginning to establish themselves along its shores. Yet the Scythians were not content to remain confined to the steppes. Their military prowess and mobility allowed them to project power far beyond their core territories. In the 7th century before the Common Era, Scythian warbands crossed the Caucasus Mountains and burst into the ancient Near East like a thunderbolt. Alongside their sometime allies, the Cimmerians, they launched devastating raids against the great powers of the region. The Assyrian Empire, at the height of its power and accustomed to being the dominant military force in the region, suddenly found itself facing a new type of enemy. These mounted archers fought unlike any foe the Assyrians had previously encountered. They struck without warning, rained arrows down upon their enemies from horseback, and vanished before retaliation could be organized. Traditional infantry formations, no matter how disciplined or well-equipped, seemed helpless against these swift-moving horsemen. The impact of these Scythian raids on the ancient Near East cannot be overstated. Cities that had stood unconquered for centuries fell to their swift attacks. Trade routes that had operated safely for generations became dangerous passages haunted by nomadic raiders. The very fabric of settled civilization in the region was torn apart by these newcomers from the steppes. Yet the Scythians were more than mere raiders. They quickly demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of regional politics and proved themselves capable of forming alliances and playing the great powers against another. Some Scythian leaders established themselves as rulers over conquered territories, while others preferred to extract tribute and move on. Their flexibility and adaptability allowed them to thrive in the complex political landscape of the ancient Near East. The Assyrians, despite their initial shock at facing these new enemies, eventually learned to deal with the Scythian threat. Diplomatic marriages were arranged, with Assyrian princesses given to Scythian kings to cement peace treaties. The Assyrians also began to adapt their military tactics, incorporating mounted archers into their own armies and learning from their nomadic adversaries. Yet even as they learned to coexist with the Scythians, the Assyrians never forgot the lesson these horsemen had taught them about the vulnerability of settled civilizations to mobile warfare. The Scythian presence in the ancient Near East was not to last forever. By the 6th century before the Common Era, the rising power of the Median Empire had begun to push back against the nomadic raiders. The Medes, themselves partly of Iranian stock, understood their Scythian cousins better than the Assyrians had. They employed similar tactics and gradually drove the Scythian warbands back across the Caucasus and into the steppes. This expulsion marked the end of the Scythian adventure in the ancient Near East, but it was far from the end of their story. Returning to the Pontic steppe, the Scythians brought with them not only the wealth they had accumulated through conquest and tribute, but also new ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that would transform their culture. The experience of ruling over settled populations and interacting with ancientizations had changed them, adding new layers of sophistication to their nomadic traditions. Back in their steppe homeland, the Scythians began to organize themselves into a more cohesive political entity. What had begun as a loose confederation of related tribes gradually evolved into something approaching a kingdom. This transformation was not unique to the Scythians, as many nomadic peoples throughout history have undergone similar processes of politicalization when central circumstances demanded it. The Scythian political system that emerged was uniquely adapted to their nomadic way of life, while incorporating lessons learned from their interactions with settled civilizations. At its head stood the king of all the Scythians, chosen from among the royal Scythians, the most prestigious of the various tribal groups that made up their confederation. This high king wielded supreme authority over all Scythian peoples, but his power was balanced by the traditional rights of clan elders and the practical limitations imposed by the nomadic lifestyle. Beneath the high king were two younger kings who ruled over specific regions of the Scythian territory. This triple monarchy allowed for more effective governance of their vast domains, while maintaining the flexibility needed for nomadic society. The system also provided a mechanism for succession, as the younger kings served as potential heirs to the high king and gained experience in leadership before potentially ascending to supreme power. The authority of these kings was not absolute in the manner of settled monarchs. Clan elders retained significant power and could even depose kings who failed to meet their expectations. This system of checks and balances reflected the egalitarian traditions of nomadic society, where leadership was based more on personal ability and the consent of the governed than on hereditary right alone. The social structure of Scythian society was far more complex than their nomadic lifestyle might suggest. By the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, clear class divisions had emerged among the Scythians. At the top stood the aristocracy, wealthy landowners who possessed vast herds and could field private armies. These nobles lived in magnificent wagons decorated with gold and silver, wore elaborate costumes adorned with precious metals, and were buried with retinues of servants and horses to serve them in the afterlife. Below the aristocracy were various levels of free com from wealthy owners, ranging herders and craftsmen, to ordinary oralists, who past made up the bulk of the population. Even among the commoners, there were significant differences in wealth and status. Some owned substantial herds and lived comfortably, while others scraped by with just enough animals to survive. The poorest free Scythians often served as herders or warriors for their wealthier relatives, bound by ties of kinship and obligation rather than formal employment. At the bottom of Scythian society were the slaves, primarily prisoners of war, taken during raids against neighbouring peoples. These captives were put to work, tending herds, crafting goods, or serving in the households of their masters. Yet even slavery among the Scythians was different from what existed in settled civilizations. Slaves could accumulate property, purchase their freedom, and in some cases even marry freeborn Scythians. The nomadic lifestyle created a more fluid social structure than was typical in agricultural societies. The wealth that supported this hierarchical society came from multiple sources. The Scythians were not simply raiders living off plunder, though warfare certainly contributed to their prosperity. They were skilled pastoralists who bred some of the finest horses in the ancient world, animals that were highly prized by settled peoples for both military and civilian use. Their herds of cattle and sheep provided meat, milk, leather and wool for both domestic consumption and trade. Trade, in fact, was crucial to Scythian prosperity. The Greek colonies established along the Black Sea coast created an eager market for Scythian products. The Greeks needed grain to feed their growing populations, and the agricultural Scythians, who lived in the forest steppe region north of the pure grasslands, were happy to provide it. In return, the Greeks offered luxury goods that the Scythian elite craved: fine wines, olive oil, decorated pottery, and worked metals. This trade relationship transformed both cultures. The Scythians began to adopt Greek artistic motifs and styles, incorporating them into their own distinctive traditions. Greek craftsmen, working to Scythian specifications, created some of the finest examples of ancient metalwork ever discovered. The result was a unique hybrid art style that combined Greek technical skill with Scythian cultural themes and sensibilities. The nomadic lifestyle of the Scythians was perfectly adapted to the vast steppes they inhabited. Their famous house wagons, pulled by teams of oxen, allowed entire families to live comfortably while following their herds across the grasslands. These mobile homes were far from primitive dwellings. Depending on the wealth of their owners, they could be elaborate affairs with multiple rooms, decorated with precious metals and fine textiles. When numerous wagons gathered together, They resembled moving cities that could appear and disappear across the landscape like mirages. The horse was central to everything the Scythians did. They were among the first peoples to master the art of mounted warfare, and their innovations in this area would influence military tactics for centuries to come. The Scythians invented the saddle, giving their riders greater stability and control than had been possible with simple blankets or pads. This seemingly simple innovation revolutionized cavalry warfare and gave the Scythians a decisive advantage over their enemies. Scythian horses were bred for speed, endurance, and intelligence. A wealthy Scythian might own hundreds or even thousands of horses, representing not just transportation but wealth, status, and military power. The horse was so central to Scythian identity that they believed their dead would need their mounts in the afterlife, leading to the practice of burying horses alongside their human companions in elaborate funeral ceremonies. The mastery of mounted archery was what made the Scythians truly formidable as warriors. Their recurved composite bows, constructed from wood, horn, sinew, and glue, represented the pinnacle of ancient bow technology. These weapons were shorter than the longbows used by infantry archers, making them ideal for use from horseback, yet they were capable of penetrating armor at considerable distances. Combined with the mobility provided by their horses, these bows made Scythian warriors nearly invincible in open terrain. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we continue to uncover the fascinating stories of civilizations that have shaped our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. The Scythians represent one of those pivotal cultures whose influence extended far beyond what their nomadic lifestyle might initially suggest, and their story is far from over. Scythian warfare was unlike anything the ancient world had previously encountered. Where traditional armies relied on disciplined formations of heavily armoured infantry supported by static archers, the Scythians perfected a form of combat that emphasized speed, mobility, and psychological warfare. Their tactical innovations would prove so effective that they would be studied and adapted by military commanders for over a millennium. The foundation of Scythian military success lay in their mastery of mounted archery. Every Scythian warrior was trained from childhood to shoot accurately from horseback, a skill that required years of practice to perfect. The coordination needed to control a galloping horse while drawing, aiming, and loosing arrows with deadly precision was extraordinary. Yet for the Scythians, this was simply part of growing up on the steppes. Their tactical repertoire centered around what would later be recognized as classic steppe warfare. Scythian horse archers would approach enemy formations at high speed, unleashing volleys of arrows before wheeling away before their opponents could respond. This hit-and-run approach allowed them to inflict casualties while remaining largely immune to retaliation. Infantry formations, no matter how well disciplined, found themselves helpless against enemies they could neither catch nor effectively counterattack. The feigned retreat was perhaps the most devastating weapon in the Scythian tactical arsenal. When faced with enemy cavalry that attempted to pursue them, Scythian warriors would appear to flee in panic, drawing their pursuers away from their supporting infantry. Once the enemy horsemen had been lured far enough from their main force, the Scythians would suddenly wheel around and attack the isolated and disorganized pursuers. This tactic required precise timing and coordination, but when executed properly, it could destroy entire enemy formations. What made these tactics particularly effective was the Scythian ability to maintain them over extended periods. As true nomads, they carried their entire society with them, making it impossible for enemies to strike at their homes or supply lines. When faced with invasion, the Scythians could simply retreat deeper into the steppes, burning the grasslands behind them and denying their enemies both food and forage. This scorched earth approach turned the vast distances of the steppe from a potential weakness into their greatest strength. The most famous demonstration of these tactics occurred when the mighty Persian Empire under Darius I attempted to conquer Scythia. In 513 before the Common Era, Darius assembled what ancient sources describe as one of the largest armies ever gathered, numbering between 700 and 800. This 1,000 soldiers' massive force crossed the Danube River and marched into Scythian territory, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the nomadic horsemen. The campaign that followed became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The Scythians refused to give battle on Persian terms, instead conducting a fighting retreat that drew the massive Persian army deeper and deeper into the steppes. Scythian horse archers harassed the Persian columns day and night, striking without warning and vanishing before the Persians could organize pursuit. The nomads poisoned wells, burned grasslands, and destroyed everything that might be useful to the invading army. As the Persians advanced, they found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the hostile steppe, while Scythian attacks made foraging dangerous and often fatal. The Persian cavalry, supposedly the finest in the world, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered and defeated in every encounter with the Scythian horse archers. Morale began to collapse as soldiers realized they were fighting and their enemy could neither catch impact of nor defeat. The psychological Scythian tactics was as important as their physical effectiveness. The constant threat of attack, the inability to engage the enemy on favorable terms, and the seeming endlessness of the steppe combined to break the spirit of even veteran troops. Persian soldiers began to desert, while others fell ill from the stress and hardships of the campaign. What had begun as a confident invasion gradually transformed into a nightmare of attrition warfare. After months of fruitless pursuit across the steppes, Darius was forced to acknowledge the failure of his campaign. The Persian army began a humiliating retreat back to the Danube, harassed every step of the way by Scythian warriors who seemed to materialize from nowhere to strike at stragglers and supply trains. The withdrawal became increasingly desperate as Persian discipline broke down and the army struggled to maintain cohesion under constant attack. The failure of the Persian invasion established the Scythians as one of the most formidable military forces in the ancient world. The Greeks, who had long dismissed all non-Greeks as barbarians, were forced to acknowledge the military genius of these nomadic warriors. Herodotus himself admitted that no army that attacked the Scythians could hope to escape destruction, while none could catch them if they chose not to be found. This military reputation opened new possibilities for the Scythians. Diplomatic. Rather than being dismissed as mere barbarians, they found themselves courted as potential allies by the great powers of the ancient world. Marriage alliances were proposed, tribute was offered, and trade agreements were negotiated. The Scythians had proven that nomadic peoples could not only resist the expansion of settled civilizations, but could actually dictate terms to them. The wealth that flowed into Scythian society from these diplomatic and military successes transformed their culture in profound ways. The aristocratic class that had always dominated Scythian society became fabulously wealthy, accumulating treasures that rivaled those of any monarchy in the ancient world. This wealth was not hoarded in royal treasuries, but was displayed in increasingly elaborate ways that reflected nomadic values and traditions. The most spectacular expression of this wealth can be found in the burial mounds or kurgans that dot the landscape of the former Scythian territories. These artificial hills, some reaching heights of over 20 meters, contained burial chambers filled with treasures that boggle the imagination. Gold was particularly prized by the Scythians, who believed it possessed magical properties and served as a physical manifestation of royal power. The craftsmanship displayed in these burial goods represents some of the finest metalwork ever produced in the ancient world. Scythian goldsmiths developed techniques that allowed them to create incredibly detailed figurines, decorative plaques, and ceremonial objects that combine technical mastery with distinctive artistic vision. The famous gold stag from Kostromsky and the panther from Kellermes have become iconic symbols of Scythian artistic achievement. What makes these artifacts particularly remarkable is their distinctive style, which scholars have dubbed the Scythian animal art tradition. Unlike the formal, stylized representations common in many ancient civilizations, Scythian artists captured animals in dynamic, naturalistic poses that conveyed movement and energy. Stags leap with legs extended, panthers crouch ready to spring, and eagles spread their wings in flight. These images were not merely decorative, but carried deep spiritual significance in Scythian religious beliefs. The animals depicted in Scythian art were not chosen randomly, but reflected the nomadic worldview and spiritual beliefs of their creators. Horses, naturally, were prominent, representing not only the foundation of Scythian society, but also serving as psychopomps that could carry the dead to the afterlife. Deer and stags symbolized regeneration and the eternal cycle of life and death. Predatory animals like panthers, lions, and eagles represented the warrior spirit and the power of the aristocratic class. The techniques used to create these masterpieces reveal the sophistication of Scythian metalworking. Gold was hammered into thin sheets and worked using repoussé techniques to create raised designs. Multiple pieces were then soldered together to create complex, three-dimensional objects. Granulation and filigree work added intricate details that are barely visible to the naked eye. The level of skill required for such work suggests the existence of specialized craftsmen who devoted their entire lives to perfecting their art. Yet the Scythians were not merely passive consumers of luxury goods created by others. Archaeological evidence reveals that they developed their own workshops and trained their own artisans. While some of the most spectacular pieces found in Scythian burials were clearly made by Greek craftsmen working to Scythian specifications, many others show purely Scythian techniques and sensibilities. This suggests a vibrant artistic tradition that could both learn from foreign influences and maintain its own distinctive character. The religious beliefs that underpinned Scythian society were as complex and sophisticated as their art. Like many ancient Iranian peoples, the Scythians worshipped a pantheon of nature deities who controlled the forces upon which nomadic life depended. These gods and goddesses were not distant, abstract beings, but active participants in daily life who required constant attention and appeasement. At the head of the Scythian pantheon stood Tabiti, the goddess of fire and hearth. As a nomadic people dependent on fire for warmth, cooking, and metalworking, the Scythians naturally revered the divine force that controlled this essential element. Tabiti was more than just a fire goddess, however. She was also associated with the sacred hearth that served as the spiritual center of each household and clan. Her worship involved elaborate rituals that included the burning of aromatic herbs and the sacrifice of animals. The Scythian religious system also included deities associated with war, hunting, and the natural world. These gods and goddesses were believed to intervene directly in human affairs, granting victory in battle, success in the hunt, and prosperity in herding. Shamanic traditions played an important role in Scythian religious practice, with specialized priests serving as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. One of the most distinctive aspects of Scythian religious practice was their use of cannabis in ritual contexts. Herodotus describes elaborate ceremonies in which the Scythians would construct small tent-like structures, place hot stones inside, and then add cannabis seeds to produce intoxicating smoke. Participants would inhale this smoke and achieve altered states of consciousness that were believed to facilitate communication with the divine realm. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the accuracy of Herodotus's account. Excavations of Scythian burial sites have uncovered bronze cauldrons containing the remains of cannabis seeds, along with tent-like structures and other paraphernalia associated with these religious ceremonies. The widespread nature of these finds suggests that cannabis use was not limited to a small priestly class, but was an integral part of Scythian religious culture. The funerary practices of the Scythians reflected their complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. The elaborate burial ceremonies described by ancient authors have been largely confirmed by archaeological excavations. When a Scythian king died, his body was mummified using sophisticated techniques that preserved it for the lengthy funeral proceedings that followed. The mummification process itself reveals the Scythians' advanced understanding of preservation techniques. The brain was removed through holes cut in the skull, while soft tissues were extracted through careful incisions. The body cavity was then cleaned and filled with aromatic herbs and grasses before being sewn back together. This process prevented decay during the extended period between death and burial, which could last for months as news of the king's death spread across the steppes and preparations were made for the funeral. The scale of royal Scythian funerals was truly extraordinary. Along with the deceased king, numerous retainers were sacrificed to serve him in the afterlife. These included his wife, cupbearer, cook, groom, and various servants and messengers. Horses and cattle were also slaughtered in large numbers, providing the king with the mounts and livestock he would need in the next world. The bodies of these sacrificial victims were carefully arranged around the royal corpse in elaborate patterns that reflected Scythian beliefs about the structure of the afterlife. The wealth buried with Scythian royalty was staggering even by ancient standards. Gold vessels, jewellery, weapons, and decorative objects were placed in the burial chamber in quantities that represented the accumulated treasure of entire kingdoms. These grave goods were not merely displays of wealth, but were believed to be necessary equipment for the deceased's journey to and life in the afterworld. Modern archaeological excavations of undisturbed Scythian tombs have revealed the accuracy of ancient descriptions and provided unprecedented insights into this remarkable civilization. The tomb at Arzan II, dating to the 7th century before the Common Era, contained over 9,000 objects, more than half of which were made of gold. The sheer quantity of precious metal found in a single burial demonstrates the vast wealth that flowed through Scythian society during its golden age. These archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of the Scythians and forced scholars to abandon outdated notions about nomadic peoples being culturally inferior to settled civilizations. The sophistication of Scythian art, the complexity of their religious beliefs, and the wealth of their society all testify to a culture that was every bit as advanced as its settled contemporaries, merely organized along different principles. At Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that the study of civilizations like the Scythians challenges many of our preconceptions about the ancient world and forces us to expand our definition of what constitutes a sophisticated society. The interactions between the Scythians and their settled neighbors created some of the most fascinating cultural exchanges in the ancient world. When Greek colonists began establishing cities along the northern shores of the Black Sea in the 7th century before the Common Era, they encountered a civilization that would challenge every assumption they held about barbarian peoples. These Greek settlements, founded by migrants from cities like Miletus, Corinth, and Megara, were initially intended as simple trading posts and agricultural colonies. What they became was something far more complex and significant. The relationship that developed between the Greeks and Scythians was unlike anything seen elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Rather than the typical pattern of conquest and subjugation that characterized most interactions between settled and nomadic peoples, the Scythians and Greeks evolved a sophisticated partnership based on mutual benefit and genuine cultural exchange. The Greeks needed grain to feed their growing populations, while the Scythians possessed vast agricultural territories in the forest steppe regions that could produce surplus crops for export. This economic relationship quickly expanded beyond simple trade in basic commodities. The Scythian elite developed an appetite for Greek luxury goods that transformed both cultures in unexpected ways. Greek wine, which had previously been consumed primarily in the Mediterranean world, found eager customers among the Scythian aristocracy. Yet the Scythians did not simply adopt Greek drinking customs wholesale. Instead, they transformed wine consumption into something uniquely their own, developing a reputation for drinking undiluted wine in quantities that shocked their Greek trading partners. The cultural exchange flowed in both directions, creating hybrid traditions that were neither purely Greek nor purely Scythian, but something entirely new. Greek craftsmen, working to satisfy Scythian patrons, began incorporating nomadic artistic motifs and themes into their work. The result was the emergence of what scholars now call Greco-Scythian art, a distinctive style that combined Greek technical expertise with Scythian cultural sensibilities and religious symbolism. Some of the most spectacular examples of this artistic fusion have been discovered in Scythian burial sites across the Pontic steppe. Greek goldsmiths created elaborate vessels depicting Scythian mythological scenes, ceremonial weapons decorated with nomadic animal motifs, and jewelry that reflected Scythian beliefs about the afterlife. These objects were not merely expensive imports, but represented a genuine blending of cultural traditions that created something greater than the sum of its parts. The intensity of Greek-Scythian contact led to the emergence of mixed populations that embodied this cultural fusion. Herodotus mentions the existence of the Callipidae, a tribe that combined Greek and Scythian ancestry and customs. Archaeological evidence supports these literary accounts, revealing settlements that show clear signs of both Greek and Scythian influence in their architecture, burial practices, and material culture. These mixed communities served as crucial intermediaries in the broader relationship between the nomadic and settled worlds. Members of such groups could navigate both cultures with ease, serving as translators, diplomats, and traders who facilitated the complex negotiations necessary for peaceful coexistence. Their very existence demonstrates that the boundaries between civilized and barbarian were far more fluid than ancient writers typically acknowledged. The prosperity that resulted from this Greek-Scythian partnership was remarkable. The Greek cities of the northern Black Sea experienced unprecedented growth and wealth during the height of Scythian power. Olbia, Chersonesos, and the cities of the Bosporan Kingdom became major centers of commerce and culture. Their wealth built on the foundation of Scythian grain exports and the luxury trade that flowed in both directions across the steppe-city divide. This economic relationship had profound effects on Scythian society itself. The wealth generated by trade with the Greeks accelerated existing trends towards social stratification and political centralization. Successful traders and those who controlled key agricultural territories accumulated vast fortunes that allowed them to challenge traditional clan-based power structures. The result was the emergence of a more hierarchical society dominated by a wealthy elite whose power derived not just from traditional nomadic sources like horse herds and warrior followings, but from their control over trade routes and agricultural production. The transformation was not limited to the economic sphere. Sustained contact with Greek culture introduced new ideas and practices that gradually permeated Scythian society. Greek artistic motifs began appearing on traditional Scythian objects, while Greek religious concepts influenced nomadic spiritual practices. Some Scythian nobles adopted Greek names or titles, and Greek tutors were employed to educate children of the elite. Yet this cultural exchange was never a one-way process of Hellenization. The Scythians proved remarkably adept at adopting foreign influences, while maintaining their essential cultural identity. They borrowed what served their purposes, while rejecting or modifying elements that conflicted with fundamental nomadic values. The result was not the replacement of Scythian culture with Greek civilization, but rather the creation of a uniquely Scythian form of cosmopolitan culture that could engage with the wider ancient world while remaining true to its steppe origins. The diplomatic relationships that emerged from this cultural and economic exchange elevated the Scythians to unprecedented heights of international influence. No longer dismissed as mere barbarian raiders, they found themselves courted as valuable allies by the great powers of the ancient world. The wealth they had accumulated through trade gave them the resources to field formidable armies, while their strategic location made them crucial players in the complex balance of power that characterized the ancient world. The Persian invasions had demonstrated that the Scythians could not be conquered by conventional military means. but the later development of their relationship with the Greeks showed that they were equally capable of sophisticated diplomacy and peaceful cooperation. This combination of military invincibility and diplomatic flexibility made them one of the most influential powers in the ancient world during the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. The internal organization of Scythian society during this period reveals a level of complexity that challenges traditional assumptions about nomadic political systems. The triple monarchy that governed the Scythian Confederation was not a primitive tribal arrangement structure adapt, but a sophisticated governmental to the unique challenges of ruling a vast nomadic empire. The High King wielded supreme authority over all Scythian peoples, but this authority was exercised through a complex network of regional governors, clan leaders, and military commanders who maintained order across territories that stretched for thousands of miles. The administrative system that supported this political structure was remarkably effective despite its apparent informality. Communication across the vast Scythian territories was maintained through an elaborate network of mounted messengers who could cover enormous distances in remarkably short periods. This system allowed the central government to respond quickly to threats or opportunities anywhere within Scythian territory, while also ensuring that local leaders remained connected to and accountable to the broader confederation. The military organization of the Scythians during their golden age represented the culmination of centuries of tactical innovation and strategic thinking. While individual warrior skills remained crucial, the Scythians had evolved sophisticated methods of coordinating large-scale cavalry operations that made their armies virtually unstoppable in open terrain. The ability to coordinate the movements of tens of thousands of mounted archers across vast distances required organizational capabilities that rivaled those of any settled civilization. The logistics of supporting such large mobile armies were staggering. Every warrior required multiple horses to maintain the speed and endurance that made Scythian tactics effective. These animals needed constant care, feeding, and replacement, creating a support system that involved entire communities dedicated to horse breeding and training. The famous Scythian horse training manual discovered at archaeological sites provides detailed instructions for developing the stamina and agility required for military service, demonstrating the scientific approach the Scythians brought to cavalry warfare. The weapons and equipment used by Scythian warriors represented the cutting edge of ancient military technology. Their composite bows were marvels of engineering that required months to construct and years to master. The complex process of laminating wood, horn, and sinew with specially prepared adhesives created weapons that were lighter, more powerful, and more durable than any alternatives available in the ancient world. The arrows used with these bows were equally sophisticated, with specially designed points for penetrating different types of armor and carefully balanced shafts that ensured accuracy at extreme ranges. The armor and protective equipment used by Scythian warriors reflected their emphasis on mobility and flexibility. Rather than the heavy bronze or iron armor favored by infantry-based armies, Scythian warriors typically wore leather or fabric armor reinforced with metal scales or plates. This equipment provided adequate protection against most weapons, while allowing the freedom of movement essential for mounted archery. Helmets were often made from organic materials like leather or felt, though wealthy warriors might own elaborate metal helmets decorated with gold or silver. The social rituals and customs that bound Scythian society together were as sophisticated as their military and political organizations. The custom of blood brotherhood, mentioned by ancient authors, created bonds of loyalty that transcended clan and tribal divisions. These artificial kinship relationships allowed the Scythians to build alliances and maintain unity across the vast distances of the steppe, creating a social network that could support their political and military activities. Feasting played a crucial role in maintaining these social bonds and reinforcing the hierarchical structure of Scythian society. The elaborate banquets described by ancient authors were not merely social occasions, but important political and religious events that served multiple functions. They provided opportunities for leaders to display their wealth and generosity, for warriors to boast of their achievements, and for the entire community to reaffirm its shared values and beliefs. The role of women in Scythian society appears to have been more complex and influential than in many contemporary civilizations. While the society was fundamentally patriarchal, women could inherit property, engage in trade, and in some cases even wield political power. The burials of wealthy Scythian women contain grave goods that rival those of male nobles, suggesting that they enjoyed high status and considerable autonomy within their society. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Scythian women may have served as warriors, though the extent and nature of female military participation remains debated among scholars. The discovery of weapons in female burials and artistic depictions that may show women in combat roles hint at a more flexible approach to gender roles than was typical in the ancient world. These findings have sparked comparisons with the legendary Amazons of Greek mythology, though the reality of Scythian women warriors was likely far more nuanced than ancient legends suggest. The religious life of the Scythians during their Golden Age became increasingly sophisticated as their wealth and international contacts expanded. While maintaining their traditional reverence for nature deities and ancestral spirits, they also incorporated foreign religious concepts and practices that enriched their spiritual traditions. The influence of Greek religious ideas is particularly evident in later Scythian art, which begins to show anthropomorphic representations of deities alongside the traditional animal symbolism. The shamanic traditions that had always been central to Scythian religious practice evolved to accommodate the changing needs of a more complex society. Professional priests emerged who specialized in particular aspects of religious ritual, while maintaining the traditional roles of healer, diviner, and intermediary with the spirit world. These religious specialists played crucial roles not only in spiritual matters, but also in the political and social organization of Scythian society. The elaborate ritual calendar that governed Scythian religious life reflects the sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles and astronomical phenomena that nomadic peoples necessarily developed. Religious festivals marked important transitions in the pastoral year, such as the spring migrations to summer pastures and the autumn return to winter quarters. These celebrations served not only religious purposes, but also provided opportunities for different tribal groups to gather, exchange information, conduct trade, and arrange marriages. The artistic achievements of the Scythians during this period represent one of the high points of ancient nomadic culture. The distinctive animal style that characterized their art evolved to incorporate new themes and techniques while maintaining its essential character. The dynamic representations of animals in motion that had always been central to Scythian art became even more sophisticated, showing influences from Greek naturalism while retaining the symbolic power that made these images meaningful to nomadic peoples. The technical mastery displayed by Scythian craftsmen during their Golden Age was extraordinary by any standard. The ability to work gold into incredibly thin sheets and then manipulate those sheets into complex three-dimensional forms required skills that took lifetimes to develop. The granulation techniques used to create intricate surface decorations were so advanced that modern jewelers struggled to reproduce them using contemporary tools and methods. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we continue to explore how these remarkable achievements challenge our understanding of what nomadic societies could accomplish when circumstances allowed their talents to flourish. The subject matter depicted in Scythian art provides fascinating insights into the worldview and daily life of these remarkable people. Hunting scenes show the importance of both subsistence hunting and the ritual hunts that served as training for warfare and demonstrations of aristocratic prowess. Depictions of mythological creatures reveal the complex spiritual beliefs that underpinned Scythian society, while scenes of daily life preserve details about clothing, equipment, and social customs that would otherwise be lost to history. The international influence of Scythian artistic styles extended far beyond their political boundaries. elements of the Scythian animal style can be traced across the Eurasian steppes, influencing the art of peoples from the Altai Mountains to the borders of China. This cultural diffusion demonstrates the extensive trade networks and population movements that connected nomadic peoples across vast distances, creating a shared cultural sphere that transcended political boundaries. The architectural achievements of the Scythians, while less visible than their metalwork, were equally impressive in their own way. The great burial mounds that dot the landscape of the former Scythian territories required enormous amounts of labour and sophisticated engineering to construct. Some of these artificial hills contain millions of cubic feet of earth and stone, moved and shaped without the benefit of wheeled vehicles or large draft animals. The precision with which the burial chambers were constructed and the elaborate drainage systems that protected them from water damage demonstrate advanced understanding of construction techniques. The temporary settlements created when Scythian communities gathered for seasonal festivals or military campaigns could house tens of thousands of people and their animals. The logistics of organizing such gatherings, providing food and water for massive populations, and maintaining order among diverse tribal groups required administrative capabilities that rivaled those of any settled civilization. The fact that these temporary cities could be assembled and dispersed with remarkable efficiency speaks to the sophisticated organizational traditions that had developed over centuries of nomadic life. The decline of classical Scythian power began in the 4th century before the Common Era, though the process was gradual and complex rather than sudden and catastrophic. Multiple factors contributed to the weakening of their confederation, including climate change that affected the productivity of their pastoral economy, pressure from new nomadic peoples moving westward from Central Asia, and the changing political dynamics of the ancient world that reduced demand for their military services. The rise of Macedonian power under Philip II and Alexander the Great created new military pressures on the Scythian world. While Alexander himself never launched a major campaign against the Scythians, his conquests in Central Asia disrupted the traditional balance of power and created new threats and opportunities that the Scythian Confederation struggled to address effectively. The death of Alexander and the subsequent fragmentation of his empire created further instability that affected Scythian territories and trade relationships. Internal divisions within Scythian society also contributed to their decline. The wealth and sophistication that had marked their golden age had created new sources of conflict as different groups competed for control over profitable trade routes and agricultural territories. Traditional clan-based loyalties were strained by the emergence of new forms of wealth and power that did not fit easily into established. The pressured social structures from the new nomadic peoples moving westward from the Central Asian steppes represented perhaps the most serious threat to Scythian dominance. The Sarmatians, themselves of Iranian stock and possessing military capabilities similar to those of the Scythians, began expanding westward in the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era. Unlike earlier conflicts between nomadic peoples that had typically resulted in the absorption of defeated groups into the victorious confederation, the Sarmatian expansion created prolonged warfare that gradually weakened both sides. The changing climate of the late 1st millennium before the Common Era also played a crucial role in Scythian decline. Cooling temperatures and reduced precipitation affected the productivity of the steppe grasslands that supported their pastoral economy. Herds that had once thrived on the abundant grasslands of the Pontic steppe found themselves competing for increasingly scarce resources, forcing difficult choices about migration patterns and territorial control. The economic changes that accompanied these environmental and political pressures fundamentally altered Scythian society. The profitable trade relationships with Greek cities that had supported their golden age became increasingly difficult to maintain as political instability disrupted established commercial networks. The demand for Scythian grain exports declined as alternative sources became available, while the luxury goods trade that had enriched the Scythian elite faced competition from new suppliers and changing tastes. Yet the decline of the classical Scythian confederation did not mean the end of Scythian influence or culture. Throughout the centuries that followed, groups that maintained Scythian traditions and identity continued to play important roles in the history of the Eurasian steppes. The artistic traditions they had developed influenced subsequent nomadic peoples, while their military innovations continued to shape cavalry warfare long after their political power had waned. The legacy of the Scythians extends far beyond their own historical period and geographical boundaries. Their demonstration that nomadic peoples could create sophisticated civilizations challenged ancient assumptions about the relationship between settlement and cultural achievement. Their military innovations influenced tactical development for centuries, while their artistic achievements established aesthetic traditions that endured long after their political power had disappeared. The transformation of Scythian society during their decline reveals the complex challenges faced by nomadic confederations when confronted with multiple simultaneous pressures. As traditional sources of wealth and power shifted, different segments of Scythian society responded in various ways that ultimately fragmented the unity that had made them so formidable. Some groups attempted to maintain their nomadic traditions by migrating further eastward, seeking new territories where the old ways could continue unchanged. Others chose to settle in fortified towns and adopt more sedentary lifestyles that offered greater security but fundamentally altered their cultural identity. The archaeological from record this period shows increasing regional variation in Scythian material culture, suggesting that the standardized traditions that had once unified their vast confederation were breaking down into localized variants. Burial practices that had remained remarkably consistent across thousands of miles began to diverge, with some areas maintaining elaborate kurgan traditions, while others adopted simpler interment methods that reflected reduced wealth and changing beliefs about the afterlife. The military organization that had been the foundation of Scythian power also underwent significant changes during this period. The massive coordinated cavalry forces that had once dominated the steppes became increasingly difficult to maintain as resources dwindled and political unity fractured. Instead of the disciplined horse archer armies that had terrorized settled civilizations, Scythian military forces devolved into smaller, more localized warbands that lacked the strategic coordination necessary for major campaigns. The relationship between the Scythians and their settled neighbors evolved dramatically during this period of decline. Greek cities that had once eagerly courted Scythian friendship found themselves dealing with increasingly unreliable partners who could no longer guarantee the security of trade routes or the steady supply of agricultural products. Some Greek settlements began hiring Scythian warriors as mercenaries rather than treating with them as equals, a shift that reflected the changing balance of power in the region. Yet even in decline, individual Scythian leaders continued to wield considerable influence in regional politics. The wealth accumulated during their golden age did not disappear overnight, and skilled Scythian commanders found ready employment in the armies of various Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's fragmented empire. These mercenary forces carried Scythian military techniques and traditions into new theatres of conflict, spreading their influence even as their homeland confederation weakened. The religious and cultural traditions of the Scythians showed remarkable resilience even as their political power waned. Archaeological evidence suggests that Scythian spiritual practices continued largely unchanged in many areas, with traditional burial rituals and religious festivals maintained despite economic hardships. The animal art style that had become synonymous with Scythian culture continued to evolve and influence neighboring peoples, creating artistic traditions that would persist for centuries after the political entity that created them had disappeared. The process of cultural transmission during the Scythian decline illustrates the complex ways in which nomadic societies could influence settled civilizations, even from positions of relative weakness. Scythian refugees and migrants carried their traditions into new territories, where they often merged with local customs to create hybrid cultures that preserved essential elements while adapting to new circumstances. These cultural fusions ensured that Scythian influence would continue long after their political confederation had ceased to exist. The interaction between declining Scythian groups and rising Sarmatian powers created particularly complex dynamics on the Pontic steppe. Rather than simple conquest and replacement, the region experienced centuries of gradual cultural blending that produced new forms of nomadic organization. The Sarmatians adopted many Scythian military techniques and artistic traditions while introducing their own innovations, creating a cultural continuity that bridged the transition between different nomadic hegemonies. The urban centers that had developed during the height of Scythian power faced particular challenges during this period of decline. Settlements that had grown wealthy from trade with nomadic peoples found their economic foundations undermined as traditional commercial relationships broke down. Some adapted by developing new forms of economic activity, while others gradually depopulated as residents migrated to more stable regions. The legacy of Scythian legal and political traditions can be traced in the governmental structures adopted by successor peoples on the steppes. The flexible monarchy system that had allowed the Scythians to govern vast territories while maintaining nomadic mobility influenced the political organization of later nomadic confederations. The balance between central authority and local autonomy that had characterized Scythian governance became a recurring theme in steppe politics. The technological innovations developed by the Scythians continued to spread across Eurasia long after their political decline. Their advances in metallurgy, particularly in the working of gold and other precious metals, influenced craftsmen from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The composite bow technology they had perfected remained the standard for mounted warfare until the introduction of firearms, while their horse training methods continued to be studied and adapted by cavalry forces throughout the ancient and medieval periods. The environmental knowledge accumulated by generations of Scythian pastoralists represented another form of cultural legacy that outlasted their political organization. Understanding of seasonal migration patterns, knowledge of water sources and pasture quality, and techniques for managing large herds in steppe environments were preserved and transmitted by successor peoples who inherited Scythian territories. This ecological wisdom proved crucial for the survival of nomadic communities in the challenging steppe environment. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that the study of civilizations like the Scythians reveals the importance of understanding decline and transformation as natural parts of historical development, rather than simple endpoints. The linguistic heritage of the Scythians provides fascinating insights into the cultural continuity that persisted despite political fragmentation. Elements of Scythian languages can be traced in various modern tongues, spoken across the former territories of their confederation, suggesting that cultural transmission continued at the popular level even when elite political structures collapsed. Place names, religious terms, and technical vocabulary related to horse breeding and metalworking show clear Scythian influences that survived for millennia after the disappearance of their political entity. The artistic traditions established during the Scythian Golden Age continue to evolve and influence subsequent cultures in ways that demonstrate the enduring power of cultural innovation. The animal style that had characterized Scythian art appeared in modified forms among peoples as distant as the Germanic tribes of northern Europe and the nomadic confederations of Central Asia. This widespread influence suggests that Scythian artistic concepts met fundamental human needs for symbolic expression that transcended specific political or ethnic boundaries. The military legacy of the Scythians proved particularly enduring, with their tactical innovations being studied and adapted by commanders across Eurasia for over a millennium after their decline. The Roman Empire, despite its emphasis on infantry-based warfare, incorporated Scythian-style horse archers into its auxiliary forces and adapted nomadic tactics for use in specific theatres of operation. The Byzantine Empire later relied heavily on mounted archers whose techniques derived directly from Scythian innovations. The trading networks established during the height of Scythian power created commercial relationships that outlasted the political structures that had originally supported them. Merchants who had learned to navigate the complex cultural landscape of the Pontic steppe continue to operate these routes, even as political authority shifted to new hands. The commercial techniques developed for trade between nomadic and settled peoples became standardized practices that facilitated exchange across cultural boundaries throughout Eurasia. The religious syncretism that had characterized later Scythian culture provided models for how nomadic and settled traditions could be successfully combined. The ability of Scythian religious practices to incorporate foreign influences while maintaining essential characteristics influenced the development of religious traditions among successor peoples. This flexible approach to spiritual matters became a characteristic feature of steppe cultures that persisted long after the original Scythian confederation had disappeared. The demographic impact of Scythian decline created population movements that reshaped the ethnic landscape of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Groups that maintained Scythian cultural identity migrated to new territories where they often became founding populations for later political entities. The genetic heritage of these populations can still be traced in modern communities across the former Scythian territories, providing physical evidence of cultural continuity that complements archaeological and linguistic data. The transformation of Scythian society during their decline also illustrates the adaptive strategies available to nomadic peoples when faced with changing circumstances. Rather than simply disappearing, Scythian communities developed new forms of organization that combined traditional nomadic values with innovations necessary for survival in altered environments. These adaptive strategies became models for how nomadic societies could maintain cultural identity while responding to external pressures. The scholarly rediscovery of the Scythians in modern times has revealed the extent to which traditional historical narratives had underestimated the achievements of nomadic civilizations. The wealth of archaeological evidence uncovered from Scythian sites has forced historians to reconsider assumptions about the relationship between settlement and cultural sophistication. This re-evaluation has had broader implications for understanding the role of nomadic peoples in world history. The preservation of Scythian cultural materials in the permanently frozen soils of Siberia has provided unprecedented insights into the daily life and material culture of ancient nomadic peoples. Organic materials that would have decayed in other climates have survived for over 2 millennia, offering detailed information about clothing, food, and household items that illuminate aspects of Scythian life rarely preserved in the archaeological record. These discoveries have revolutionized understanding of nomadic material culture and challenged assumptions about the poverty of nomadic lifestyles. The international significance of Scythian archaeological discoveries has made them symbols of cultural heritage for modern nations that occupy their former territories. Museums across Eastern Europe and Central Asia house Scythian collections that attract visitors from around the world, while scholarly conferences dedicated to Scythian studies bring together researchers from dozens of countries. This international interest demonstrates the continuing relevance of Scythian achievements for understanding human cultural development. The technological analysis of Scythian artifacts using modern scientific methods has revealed the sophistication of their manufacturing techniques and the extent of their trade networks. Chemical analysis of gold objects shows that Scythian craftsmen worked with materials sourced from locations thousands of miles apart, while microscopic examination of textiles reveals complex weaving techniques that produced fabrics of extraordinary quality. These scientific studies have provided objective evidence for the high level of Scythian technological achievement. The influence of Scythian culture on later nomadic confederations can be traced through similarities in political organization, military tactics, and artistic traditions. The Hunnic confederation that would later terrorize the Roman Empire showed clear Scythian influences in their governmental structures and military methods, while the Mongol Empire incorporated tactical innovations that could be traced back to Scythian origins. This cultural continuity suggests that nomadic traditions provided effective solutions to the challenges of organizing large-scale societies on the steppes. The economic systems developed by the Scythians for managing pastoral resources and facilitating long-distance trade, provided models that continued to influence steppe societies for centuries after their political decline. The techniques they developed for coordinating the movements of large herds across vast territories required sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and resource management that remained relevant for subsequent nomadic peoples. Similarly, their methods for facilitating trade between different cultural groups established precedents for commercial relationships that persisted long after their original creators had disappeared. The social institutions that had allowed Scythian society to maintain unity across vast distances and diverse populations provided inspiration for later attempts at nomadic confederation. The balance they achieved between central authority and local autonomy, the mechanisms they developed for resolving conflicts between different tribal groups, and the cultural traditions they used to maintain group identity, all became elements in the political toolkit available to subsequent nomadic leaders. The educational value of studying Scythian civilization extends beyond its historical significance to provide insights into alternative forms of social organization that challenge conventional assumptions about human development. Their demonstration that sophisticated cultures could emerge from nomadic foundations offers important perspectives on the relationship between lifestyle and achievement that remain relevant for understanding contemporary societies. The flexibility and adaptability that characterized Scythian culture provide models for how societies can maintain essential values while responding to changing circumstances. The continuing discovery of new Scythian archaeological sites ensures that our understanding of their civilization will continue to evolve as more evidence becomes available. Recent excavations have uncovered settlements and burial sites that fill gaps in the historical record and provide new insights into previously unknown aspects of Scythian culture. These ongoing discoveries demonstrate that much remains to be learned about these remarkable people and their lasting influence on human civilization. The story of the Scythians ultimately represents one of history's great examples of how cultural achievement can transcend political boundaries and temporal limitations. Their influence on art, warfare, technology, and social organization continued long after their confederation had ceased to exist, demonstrating the power of innovation and cultural creativity to outlast the specific circumstances that originally produced them. Understanding their achievements and legacy provides crucial insights into the complex processes through which human societies develop, adapt, and influence one another across time and space. The environmental challenges that confronted later Scythian communities forced them to develop new strategies for survival that would influence nomadic adaptation for generations to come. As the climate grew colder and precipitation patterns shifted across the Pontic steppe, traditional pastoral cycles that had sustained their ancestors for centuries no longer provided reliable sustenance. Herds that had once thrived on abundant summer grasslands found themselves competing for increasingly scarce resources, while the timing of seasonal migrations had to be adjusted to account for unpredictable weather patterns. These ecological pressures created cascading effects throughout Scythian society that extended far beyond simple resource management. Communities that had maintained stable territorial boundaries for generations were forced to negotiate new arrangements, as traditional grazing areas became inadequate to support their livestock. The complex web of agreements and customs that had governed access to water sources and seasonal pastures required constant renegotiation as environmental conditions continued to deteriorate. The response of different Scythian groups to these challenges reveals the remarkable adaptability that had always characterized their culture. Some communities chose to intensify their agricultural activities in the forest steppe regions, developing new techniques for grain that could supplement production, the declining productivity of their pastoral economy. These agricultural innovations required significant changes in settlement patterns and social organization, as communities that had previously been highly mobile were forced to establish more permanent bases around their farming operations. Other groups responded by modifying their pastoral practices to extract maximum value from diminished grasslands. They developed new breeding programs that emphasized hardier livestock varieties capable of surviving on poorer forage, while also experimenting with different herd compositions that could make more efficient use of available resources. These innovations required detailed knowledge of animal husbandry and ecological relationships that demonstrated the sophisticated understanding Scythian communities had developed through centuries of steppe life. The technological adaptations that emerged during this period of environmental stress showcase the innovative capacity that had always been central to Scythian culture. Metalworkers developed new techniques for creating more efficient tools and weapons using reduced quantities of raw materials, while craftsmen experimented with alternative materials that could substitute for increasingly expensive imports. These innovations often proved superior to traditional methods and were subsequently adopted by neighboring peoples who faced similar resource constraints. The social reorganization that accompanied these environmental adaptations created new forms of community structure that blended traditional nomadic values with the practical requirements of changed circumstances. Leadership roles evolved to emphasize skills relevant to the new challenges, with individuals who possessed expertise in agricultural techniques or resource management gaining influence alongside traditional warrior elites. This evolution in social hierarchy reflected the pragmatic approach to adaptation that had always characterized Scythian culture. The religious responses to environmental crisis reveal the spiritual dimensions of Scythian adaptation strategies. Traditional ceremonies were modified to address new concerns about climate and agricultural productivity, while religious specialists developed new rituals designed to ensure favorable weather conditions and protect livestock from disease. These spiritual innovations often incorporated elements borrowed from neighboring agricultural peoples, demonstrating the continued openness to foreign influences that had characterized Scythian culture throughout their history. The artistic expression that emerged during this period of transition reflects both the challenges and opportunities created by changing circumstances, while the elaborate gold work that had characterized their golden age became less common due to reduced wealth and limited access to raw materials. New artistic traditions emerged that emphasized different materials and techniques. Craftsmen developed sophisticated methods for working with iron, bronze, and organic materials, creating objects that maintained the distinctive Scythian aesthetic while adapting to practical constraints. The evolution of Scythian military organization during this period illustrates their continued ability to innovate in response to changing strategic circumstances. As the massive cavalry formations that had once dominated the steppes became increasingly difficult to maintain, military leaders developed new tactical approaches that emphasized smaller, more flexible units, capable of operating effectively with limited resources. These innovations often proved highly effective and were subsequently adopted by other nomadic peoples facing similar challenges. The diplomatic strategies employed by later Scythian communities reflect their sophisticated understanding of regional political dynamics and their to leverage their remaining strengths in negotiations with more powerful neighbors. Rather than attempting to maintain their traditional role as regional hegemons, Scythian leaders developed new approaches to international relations that emphasized their value as allies and trading partners. These diplomatic innovations often proved remarkably successful in securing favorable terms despite their reduced military capabilities. The commercial adaptations that characterized this period demonstrate the entrepreneurial spirit that had always been central to Scythian culture. As traditional trade relationships became less profitable, Scythian merchants developed new commercial strategies that took advantage of their unique position between different cultural zones. They became specialists in facilitating exchange between emerging powers, using their accumulated knowledge of diverse languages and customs to create profitable niches in evolving markets. The educational traditions that emerged during this period of transformation reveal the mechanisms through which Scythian communities preserved essential cultural knowledge while adapting to new circumstances. Formal systems for transmitting specialized skills became more important, as traditional apprenticeship methods proved inadequate for the rapid changes required by altered conditions. These educational innovations ensured that crucial knowledge about animal husbandry, metalworking, and other essential skills would be preserved for future generations. The linguistic developments that occurred during this period of cultural transformation provide insights into the processes through which nomadic societies adapted their communication systems to meet changing needs. New vocabulary emerged to describe novel technologies and practices, while traditional terms acquired expanded meanings that reflected altered social relationships. These linguistic changes often spread to neighboring peoples through trade and intermarriage, creating shared terminology that facilitated communication across cultural boundaries. The architectural innovations that appeared during this transitional period demonstrate the creative responses Scythian communities developed to address new settlement requirements. Traditional mobile dwellings were modified to provide greater protection against harsh weather conditions, while new building techniques were developed for the semi-permanent structures required by intensified agricultural activities. These architectural adaptations often combined nomadic mobility requirements with the stability needs of settled activities. The medical knowledge that Scythian communities accumulated during this period of environmental stress reveals their systematic approach to addressing health challenges created by changing living conditions. Traditional healing practices were expanded to address new diseases and nutritional deficiencies that emerged as communities adapted their lifestyles, while new treatments were developed through experimentation and exchange with neighboring peoples. This medical knowledge often proved valuable to other communities facing similar challenges. The legal innovations that emerged during this period of social transformation illustrate the mechanisms through which Scythian communities adapted their traditional governance systems to address new types of conflicts and relationships. Customary law was modified to address disputes arising from intensified agricultural activities, while new procedures were developed for managing relationships with settled neighbors. These legal adaptations often provided models that were subsequently adopted by other transitional societies. The technological transfer that occurred during this period of cultural exchange demonstrates the continuing influence of Scythian innovations on neighboring peoples. Despite their reduced political power, Scythian communities remained important sources of specialized knowledge that proved valuable to emerging powers in the region. Their expertise in metallurgy, animal husbandry, and military tactics continued to be sought after by rulers seeking to strengthen their own capabilities. The demographic patterns that characterize this period of Scythian transformation reveal the complex population movements that accompanied cultural adaptation. Some communities chose to maintain their traditional nomadic lifestyle by migrating to regions where environmental conditions remained favorable, while others established permanent settlements in areas that offered new economic opportunities. These population movements created networks of related communities that maintained cultural connections across vast distances. The cultural synthesis that emerged from these adaptation processes demonstrates the remarkable ability of Scythian society to maintain essential elements of their identity while incorporating new influences. The hybrid cultures that developed during this period combined traditional nomadic values with innovations borrowed from agricultural peoples, creating distinctive regional variants that remained recognizably Scythian while adapting to local circumstances. These synthetic cultures often proved highly successful and provided models for other transitional societies. At Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that periods of cultural transformation often reveal the most essential characteristics of civilizations and their capacity for adaptation and innovation. The archaeological evidence from this transitional period provides unprecedented insights into the daily lives of Scythian communities as they navigated the challenges of cultural adaptation. Excavations of settlements from this era reveal the material evidence of innovation and compromise, showing how traditional crafts were modified to work with new materials while maintaining essential aesthetic and functional characteristics. The stratification of these sites demonstrates the gradual nature of cultural change and the persistence of traditional elements alongside new adaptations. The preservation conditions at many sites from this period have allowed for the recovery of organic materials that illuminate aspects of Scythian life rarely visible in the archaeological record. Textiles, wooden implements, and food remains provide detailed information about how communities adapted their material culture to meet changing circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity. These discoveries have revolutionized understanding of the adaptation strategies available to nomadic societies facing environmental and political pressures. The comparative analysis of contemporary sites across the former Scythian territories reveals the diversity of responses that different communities developed to address similar challenges. While some regions show evidence of intensified agricultural development, others demonstrate continued emphasis on pastoral activities using modified techniques. This regional variation illustrates the flexibility of Scythian cultural traditions and their ability to support different adaptation strategies while maintaining overall cultural coherence. The technological analysis of artifacts from this period demonstrates the sophistication of Scythian manufacturing techniques and their continued innovation despite resource constraints. Metallurgical studies reveal new alloy compositions that maximize the utility of available materials, while analysis of ceramic production shows the development of new firing techniques that improve the durability of everyday objects. These technological innovations often proved superior to traditional methods and influenced manufacturing practices across the region. The artistic continuity that characterizes this period, despite significant social and economic changes, demonstrates the central role of aesthetic traditions in maintaining cultural identity. While the materials and techniques used in artistic production evolved to accommodate new circumstances, the fundamental design principles and symbolic content remained recognizably Scythian. This artistic continuity provided a crucial mechanism for maintaining group identity during a period of rapid change. The religious adaptations that occurred during this transitional period reveal the spiritual dimensions of cultural transformation and the mechanisms through which traditional belief systems incorporated new elements while maintaining essential characteristics. Archaeological evidence shows the construction of new types of religious sites that combine traditional Scythian elements with influences from neighboring cultures, creating hybrid sacred spaces that reflected the synthetic nature of evolving communities. The burial practices that characterize this period demonstrate both continuity and change in Scythian attitudes toward death and the afterlife. While the elaborate kurgan tradition continued in some regions, modified burial practices emerged that reflected changed economic circumstances, while maintaining essential spiritual elements. The grave goods associated with these burials provide insights into the material culture of transitional communities and the values they chose to preserve or modify. The settlement patterns that developed during this period reflect the diverse strategies Scythian communities employed to address changing environmental and political conditions. Some areas show the emergence of fortified settlements that provided security for communities engaged in agricultural activities, while others demonstrate the development of specialized sites focused on particular economic activities such as metallurgy or animal processing. These varied settlement patterns illustrate the flexibility of Scythian social organization. The economic networks that emerged during this transitional period demonstrate the continued commercial acumen of Scythian communities and to identify new opportunities in changing markets. Archaeological evidence shows the development of new trade routes and the establishment of commercial relationships with previously unconnected regions. These economic innovations often proved highly profitable and provided crucial resources for communities adapting to new circumstances. The military innovations that characterize this period reflect the continued importance of warfare in Scythian society and their ability to adapt traditional martial skills to new strategic requirements. While the massive cavalry formations of their golden age were no longer feasible, new tactical approaches emerged that emphasized mobility and flexibility while making efficient use of available resources. These military adaptations often proved highly effective and influenced the development of warfare across the region. The diplomatic strategies that Scythian communities employed during this period demonstrate their sophisticated understanding of international relations and their ability to negotiate favorable positions despite reduced power. Rather than relying solely on military intimidation, Scythian leaders developed new approaches to diplomacy that emphasized their value as allies and commercial partners. These diplomatic innovations often secured better terms than might have been expected given their military position. The cultural exchange that intensified during this period of transformation created new forms of artistic and intellectual synthesis that enriched all participating communities. Scythian traditions merged with influences from Greek, Iranian, and other cultures to create hybrid forms that were often more sophisticated than their individual components. This cultural fusion demonstrates the creative potential that emerges when different traditions encounter each other under favorable circumstances. The linguistic evidence from this period reveals the complex processes through which language change accompanies cultural transformation. New vocabulary emerged to describe novel technologies and social relationships, while traditional terms acquired expanded meanings that reflected changing circumstances. The preservation of core linguistic elements alongside new borrowings demonstrates the mechanisms through which cultural continuity can be maintained during periods of rapid change. The environmental data that can be reconstructed for this period provides crucial context for understanding the challenges that Scythian communities faced and the effectiveness of their adaptation strategies. Climate records show the extent of environmental change that occurred during this transitional period, while archaeological evidence reveals how communities modified their subsistence practices to address altered conditions. This environmental context is essential for evaluating the success of different adaptation strategies. The demographic analysis of this period reveals the complex population dynamics that accompanied cultural transformation. Migration patterns show how different communities responded to changing circumstances, while genetic studies of ancient remains provide insights into the biological dimensions of cultural mixing. These demographic patterns help explain the mechanisms through which cultural traits were transmitted and modified across different populations. The technological diffusion that occurred during this period demonstrates the continuing influence of Scythian innovations on neighboring societies. Despite their reduced political power, Scythian communities remained important sources of specialized knowledge that proved valuable to emerging powers throughout the region. Their expertise in various fields continued to be sought after and adapted by other societies facing similar challenges. The social evolution that characterized this transitional period reveals the mechanisms through which traditional nomadic societies could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential cultural characteristics. New forms of leadership emerged that combined traditional authority with expertise relevant to contemporary challenges, while social institutions evolved to address new types of relationships and conflicts. These social innovations provided models for other societies undergoing similar transformations. The educational systems that developed during this period demonstrate the importance of knowledge transmission in maintaining cultural continuity during times of change. Formal mechanisms for teaching specialized skills became increasingly important as traditional apprenticeship methods proved inadequate for rapidly evolving requirements. These educational innovations ensured that crucial cultural knowledge would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The religious synthesis that emerged during this period reflects the spiritual dimensions of cultural adaptation and the mechanisms through which traditional belief systems could incorporate new elements while maintaining essential characteristics. The development of new ritual practices and the construction of hybrid sacred sites demonstrate the creativity which Scythian communities address with the spiritual challenges of cultural transformation. The artistic evolution that continued during this transitional period demonstrates the central role of aesthetic expression in maintaining cultural identity and facilitating adaptation to new circumstances. While materials and techniques evolved to accommodate practical constraints, the fundamental design principles and symbolic content that defined Scythian art remained recognizable. This artistic continuity provided crucial psychological and social benefits during a period of significant change. The architectural innovations that appeared during this period reflect the practical challenges of creating built environments that could serve both traditional nomadic needs and new requirements imposed by changing lifestyles. The development of hybrid building types that combine mobility with stability represents a significant achievement in adaptive design that influenced subsequent architectural traditions across the region. The legacy of this transitional period in Scythian history extends far beyond its immediate chronological boundaries to influence the development of nomadic societies Eurasia. The adaptation throughout strategies developed during this crucial period provided models for how traditional cultures could respond to environmental and political pressures while maintaining essential characteristics. These innovations became part of the cultural toolkit available to subsequent nomadic peoples facing similar challenges. The scholarly significance of studying this transitional period lies in its demonstration of the complex processes through which societies adapt to changing circumstances. The Scythian example provides crucial insights into the mechanisms of cultural change and the factors that determine whether adaptation efforts succeed or fail. Understanding these processes remains relevant for contemporary societies facing environmental and social pressures that require significant cultural adaptations. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we continue to explore how the study of transitional periods in ancient civilizations provides insights into the universal challenges of cultural adaptation and the creative potential that emerges when societies successfully navigate periods of significant change. The written sources that document the final centuries of Scythian political organization reveal the complex interplay between internal transformation and external pressures that ultimately reshaped the entire cultural landscape of the Pontic steppe. Greek historians of the Hellenistic period, writing from the perspective of the Black Sea colonies that had maintained commercial relationships with Scythian communities for centuries, provide detailed accounts of the gradual fragmentation of what had once been a unified confederation spanning thousands of miles of grassland territory. These contemporary observers noted significant changes in the political structures that governed Scythian society during the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. The triple monarchy that had successfully coordinated the activities of diverse tribal groups across vast distances began to show signs of strain as regional leaders increasingly pursued independent policies that reflected local concerns rather than confederation-wide interests. The High King's authority, while still nominally recognized, became increasingly difficult to enforce as communication networks deteriorated and traditional mechanisms of political control proved inadequate for addressing new challenges. The emergence of rival power traditional centers within Scythian territories created complex political dynamics that ancient authors struggled to understand and describe. Different regions developed distinct responses to the pressures they faced, with some areas maintaining traditional nomadic organization, while others experimented with new forms of governance that incorporated elements borrowed from neighboring settled civilizations. These divergent evolutionary paths created a patchwork of related but increasingly distinct political entities that maintained cultural connections while pursuing separate destinies. The Sarmatian expansion westward during this period represented more than the simple territorial conquest. It constituted a fundamental reshaping of the political and cultural landscape of the Western steppes. The newcomers brought with them their own traditions of governance and warfare, yet they also proved remarkably adept at incorporating useful elements from the Scythian societies they encountered. This process of selective cultural adoption created hybrid communities that combined Sarmatian political structures with Scythian artistic traditions, and the archaeological military techniques record from this period reveals the material evidence of these complex cultural negotiations. Burial sites show increasing variation in grave goods and construction techniques, reflecting the emergence of new elite groups whose power derived from different sources than traditional Scythian aristocracy. Some burials maintain the elaborate kurgan tradition with its emphasis on horse sacrifice and golden grave goods, while others demonstrate new burial customs that reflect alternative beliefs about death and the afterlife. The artistic production of this transitional period demonstrates remarkable creativity as craftsmen adapted traditional techniques to new materials and markets. The animal style that had characterized Scythian art for centuries evolved to incorporate new symbolic elements and aesthetic influences, creating hybrid forms that remained recognizably Scythian while reflecting changed circumstances. Metalworkers developed innovative techniques for creating elaborate objects using reduced quantities of precious materials, often achieving effects that were more sophisticated than their predecessors, despite working with more limited resources. The commercial networks that had sustained Scythian prosperity during their golden age underwent significant reorganization during this period of political fragmentation. Trade routes that had once operated under the protection of a unified confederation now required complex negotiations with multiple authorities, each seeking to extract maximum benefit from commercial activities passing through their territories. Merchants adapted by developing new strategies that took advantage of competition between different political entities, often playing rival groups against one another to secure favorable terms. The religious evolution that accompanied these political and social changes reveals the spiritual dimensions of cultural transformation. Traditional Scythian deities continued to be worshipped, but their cults were increasingly influenced by religious practices borrowed from neighboring peoples. New ceremonial sites emerged that combined traditional elements with foreign architectural forms, creating sacred spaces that reflected the synthetic nature of evolving communities. The shamanic traditions that had always been central to Scythian spiritual life adapted to incorporate new healing techniques and divinatory practices that address the specific challenges of transitional societies. The linguistic evidence from this period provides insights into the mechanisms through which cultural change was facilitated and resisted. While core vocabulary related to traditional nomadic activities remained stable, new terms emerged to describe novel political arrangements, commercial relationships, and technological innovations. The preservation of traditional oral literature alongside the adoption of new narrative forms demonstrates the complex negotiations between continuity and change that characterized all aspects of Scythian cultural evolution. The military developments that occurred during this transitional period reflect the continued importance of warfare in determining political relationships on the steppes. Traditional Scythian cavalry tactics were modified to address new strategic challenges, while military leaders experimented with combined arms approaches that integrated nomadic mobility with defensive techniques borrowed from settled civilizations. These tactical innovations often proved highly effective and were subsequently adopted by neighboring peoples facing similar military pressures. The settlement patterns that emerged during this period reveal the diverse strategies that different communities employed to address changing environmental and political conditions. Some regions witnessed the construction of fortified centers that could provide security for surrounding pastoral populations, while others maintained traditional mobility patterns modified to accommodate new territorial arrangements. These varied approaches to settlement demonstrate the flexibility of Scythian social organization and its capacity for adaptation without abandoning essential cultural characteristics. The demographic changes that accompanied political fragmentation created new patterns of population distribution across the former Scythian territories. Some communities chose to migrate to regions where traditional lifestyles could be maintained with minimal modification, while others remained in ancestral territories and adapted their practices to accommodate new circumstances. These population movements created networks of related communities that maintained cultural connections despite geographical separation and political independence. The technological innovations that emerged during this period demonstrate the continued creative capacity of Scythian craftsmen and their ability to develop solutions to practical problems using available resources. Metallurgical techniques were refined to maximize the utility of increasingly scarce raw materials, while new approaches to animal husbandry were developed to maintain productivity despite environmental pressures. These innovations often proved superior to traditional methods and influenced technological development throughout the region. The educational traditions that evolved during this transitional period reflect the changing needs of communities adapting to new circumstances. Formal systems for transmitting specialized knowledge became increasingly important as traditional apprenticeship methods proved inadequate for the rapid changes required by altered conditions. These educational innovations ensured that crucial skills would be preserved and transmitted to future generations, while also facilitating the adoption of new techniques and practices. The artistic patronage systems that supported cultural production during this period underwent significant transformation as traditional sources of wealth and authority evolved. New elite groups emerged, whose aesthetic preferences differed from those of traditional Scythian aristocracy, leading to the development of modified artistic styles that incorporated foreign influences while maintaining recognizable cultural characteristics. These evolving patronage relationships created opportunities for artistic innovation, while also ensuring the continuation of essential cultural traditions. The commercial law that governed trade relationships during this period reveals the sophisticated understanding of economic relationships that Scythian communities had developed through centuries of commercial activity. Legal innovations emerged to address new types of commercial disputes and relationships, while traditional customs were modified to accommodate changed circumstances. These legal developments often provided models that were subsequently adopted by neighboring societies engaged in similar commercial activities. The diplomatic practices that characterize this period demonstrate the continued political sophistication of Scythian leaders and their ability to navigate complex international relationships despite reduced military power. New approaches to treaty-making emerged that emphasized mutual benefit rather than simple domination, while traditional ceremonies were modified to accommodate the diplomatic requirements of multilateral relationships. These diplomatic innovations often secured favorable terms for Scythian communities despite their changed circumstances. The environmental management strategies that developed during this period reflect the accumulated ecological knowledge of generations of nomadic peoples and their ability to adapt traditional practices to changing conditions. New approaches to pasture management were developed that maximize productivity while minimizing environmental degradation, while water management techniques were refined to address altered precipitation patterns. These environmental innovations often proved highly effective and influenced resource management practices throughout the region. The social institutions that emerged during this transitional period demonstrate the mechanisms through which traditional nomadic societies could maintain essential characteristics while adapting to new circumstances. Leadership roles evolved to emphasize skills relevant to contemporary challenges, while conflict resolution mechanisms were modified to address new types of disputes. These social innovations provided stability during periods of rapid change, while also facilitating necessary adaptations. The cultural transmission mechanisms that operated during this period reveal the processes through which essential knowledge and traditions were preserved despite significant social and political changes. Oral traditions were modified to incorporate new historical experiences while maintaining core cultural values, while ritual practices were adapted to address contemporary spiritual needs. These transmission mechanisms ensured cultural continuity while also allowing for necessary innovations. The regional variation that characterized Scythian culture during this period reflects the diverse responses that different communities developed to address similar challenges. While some areas maintained relatively traditional practices with minimal modifications, others experimented with radical innovations that fundamentally altered their social organization. This diversity of approaches demonstrates the flexibility of Scythian cultural traditions and their capacity to support different adaptation strategies while maintaining overall cultural coherence. The influence of Hellenistic culture during this period created new opportunities for cultural synthesis and artistic innovation. Greek artistic motifs and technical approaches were incorporated into traditional Scythian crafts, while Hellenistic philosophical and religious concepts influenced nomadic intellectual traditions. These cultural exchanges often produced hybrid forms that were more sophisticated than their individual components, demonstrating the creative potential that emerges when different traditions encounter each other under favorable circumstances. The archaeological preservation at sites from this period has provided unprecedented insights into the daily lives of communities navigating cultural transformation. The recovery of organic materials that rarely survive in archaeological contexts has illuminated aspects of material culture that would otherwise remain invisible, while the stratification of transitional sites has revealed the gradual nature of cultural change and the persistence of traditional elements alongside new adaptations. The comparative analysis of contemporary developments across different regions of the former Scythian territories reveals both the unity and diversity of responses to similar challenges. While certain adaptation strategies appear to have been widely adopted, significant regional variations demonstrate the importance of local conditions in determining the specific forms that cultural change would take. This comparative perspective provides crucial insights into the factors that influence the success or failure of different adaptation strategies. At Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that understanding these transitional periods is crucial for appreciating the full complexity of human cultural development and the remarkable capacity of societies to reinvent themselves while maintaining essential characteristics. The urban developments that occurred in some regions during this transitional period represent a fascinating departure from traditional nomadic settlement patterns. Archaeological excavations have revealed the construction of substantial fortified centers that combined defensive capabilities with commercial and administrative functions. These proto-urban settlements demonstrate the ability of formerly nomadic communities to adopt new forms of social organization when circumstances required it, while also maintaining essential cultural characteristics that distinguish them from purely settled civilizations. The architectural innovations displayed at these sites reveal sophisticated understanding of defensive engineering and urban planning principles. Fortification systems incorporated both traditional steppe warfare considerations and defensive techniques borrowed from settled neighbors, creating hybrid defensive approaches that proved highly effective against diverse types of military threats. The internal organization of these settlements reflected nomadic social hierarchies and spatial concepts, creating urban environments that felt familiar to communities transitioning from mobile to sedentary lifestyles. The craft specialization that emerged at these urban centers represents a significant evolution in Scythian economic organization. While traditional nomadic society had always included skilled artisans, the concentration of craftsmen at fixed locations allowed for new levels of technical sophistication and product standardization. Workshops specializing in particular types of metalwork, textile production, or ceramic manufacture could achieve economies of scale impossible under traditional mobile conditions, while also facilitating the transmission of technical knowledge between different generations of craftsmen. The commercial facilities that developed at these centers demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of trade relationships that Scythian communities had accumulated through centuries of commercial activity. Market areas were designed to accommodate both local pastoral populations and long-distance merchants, while storage facilities were constructed to handle the seasonal fluctuations characteristic of nomadic economic cycles. These commercial innovations often proved so successful that they were subsequently copied by neighboring communities seeking to capture similar economic benefits. The administrative systems that emerged to govern these complex settlements reveal the continued evolution of Scythian political organization. Traditional clan-based authority structures were modified to address the needs of concentrated populations, while new mechanisms were developed for coordinating relationships between settled and nomadic elements of the community. These governmental innovations often provided models that influenced political development throughout the region. The religious architecture that appeared at these sites reflects the spiritual dimensions of cultural transformation and the mechanisms through which traditional belief systems adapted to new circumstances. Sacred spaces were designed to accommodate both traditional nomadic ceremonies and new ritual practices that reflected urban life, creating hybrid religious environments that served the spiritual needs of transitional communities. These architectural innovations often influenced religious development across much broader geographical areas. The demographic composition of these emerging urban centers reveals the complex population dynamics that accompanied cultural transformation. Archaeological evidence suggests that these settlements attracted residents from diverse backgrounds, including traditional nomadic populations, settled agricultural communities, and immigrant craftsmen and merchants from distant regions. This demographic diversity created opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation, while also presenting challenges for maintaining social cohesion. The economic specialization that characterized these urban developments demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of comparative advantage that Scythian communities had developed through their commercial activities. Different centers specialized in particular types of production or services, creating regional networks that could efficiently distribute goods and services across large geographical areas. These economic networks often proved remarkably resilient and continued to operate effectively despite political instability and military conflicts. The technological transfer that occurred at these urban centers facilitated the rapid diffusion of innovations across cultural boundaries. Craftsmen working in close proximity could easily observe and adapt techniques developed by specialists from different cultural traditions, leading to the emergence of hybrid technologies that combined the best features of diverse approaches. These technological syntheses often proved superior to their individual components and were subsequently adopted by communities across much broader geographical ranges. The educational institutions that developed at these centers reflect the changing requirements for knowledge transmission in increasingly complex societies. Formal schools and apprenticeship programs emerged to supplement traditional methods of cultural transmission, while libraries and archives were established to preserve important information for future reference. These educational innovations ensured that crucial knowledge would be maintained despite the social disruptions accompanying cultural transformation. The legal systems that governed these urban centers had to address new types of relationships and conflicts that arose from concentrated settlement and economic specialization. Traditional customary law was supplemented with formal legal codes that addressed commercial disputes, property rights, and the complex relationships between different ethnic and social groups. These legal innovations often provided models that influenced juridical development throughout the region. The artistic production that flourished at these centers demonstrates the creative potential that emerges when diverse cultural traditions encounter each other under favorable circumstances. Workshops that brought together craftsmen from different backgrounds produced innovative works that combined technical approaches and aesthetic sensibilities in unprecedented ways. These artistic syntheses often achieved levels of sophistication that surpassed their individual cultural components. The military organization that protected these urban centers had to address new types of strategic challenges that differed significantly from traditional nomadic warfare. Defensive forces had to be capable of protecting fixed positions against siege warfare, while also maintaining the mobility necessary for pursuing retreating enemies. These military innovations often influenced tactical development across much broader geographical areas. The diplomatic relationships that these centers maintained with neighboring communities reveal the sophisticated understanding of international relations that their leaders had developed. Treaties and alliances were negotiated that balanced the need for security with the requirements of profitable commercial relationships, while cultural exchanges were facilitated that enriched all participating communities. These diplomatic innovations often provided models for interstate relationships, political development throughout the region. That influence environmental management practices that were implemented at these centers demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that nomadic communities had developed through centuries of steppe life. Urban planning incorporated considerations of water management, waste disposal, and resource conservation that reflected accumulated environmental knowledge, while also addressing the new challenges posed by concentrated settlement. These environmental innovations often influenced urban development practices across much broader geographical areas. The social integration mechanisms that operated at these centers reveal the processes through which diverse populations could be successfully combined into functioning communities. Cultural festivals, religious ceremonies, and commercial activities provided opportunities for different groups to interact and develop shared identities, while legal and administrative systems ensured that conflicts could be resolved peacefully. These integration mechanisms often proved so successful that they were subsequently adopted by other communities facing similar demographic challenges. The economic regulation that governed commercial activities at these centers reflects the sophisticated understanding of market relationships that Scythian communities had developed through their trading activities. Standards for weights and measures were established to facilitate fair exchange, while quality control mechanisms ensured that products met acceptable standards. These commercial regulations often influenced trade practices across much broader geographical areas. The cultural preservation efforts that were undertaken at these centers demonstrate the conscious attempts to maintain essential traditions despite significant social changes. Traditional crafts, oral literature, and ceremonial practices were formally supported and transmitted to new generations, while archives were established to preserve important cultural information. These preservation efforts ensured that crucial elements of Scythian culture would survive the transformations of the transitional period. The architectural styles that emerged at these centers reflect the creative synthesis of diverse building traditions and the development of new approaches to urban design. Construction techniques borrowed from different cultural sources were combined with innovations developed to address specific local conditions, creating distinctive architectural styles that influenced building practices throughout the region. These architectural innovations often proved so successful that they continued to influence urban development long after the original centers had declined. The technological workshops that operated at these centers facilitated the development of new manufacturing techniques and the improvement of existing technologies. The concentration of skilled craftsmen and the availability of diverse raw materials created ideal conditions for technological innovation, while the commercial networks that connected these centers ensured that successful innovations would be rapidly diffused to other communities. These technological developments often had impacts that extended far beyond their original contexts. The religious syncretism that characterized these centers reveals the spiritual dimensions of cultural transformation and the mechanisms through which different belief systems could be successfully combined. Traditional nomadic spiritual practices were merged with religious concepts borrowed from settled neighbors, creating hybrid belief systems that served the spiritual needs of diverse populations. These religious syntheses often influenced spiritual development across much broader geographical areas. The educational exchange that occurred at these centers facilitated the transmission of knowledge between different cultural traditions and the development of new approaches to learning and instruction. Students and teachers from diverse backgrounds shared their knowledge and techniques, creating educational environments that were more sophisticated than any of their individual cultural components. These educational innovations often influenced intellectual development throughout the region. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we continue to explore how these urban experiments represent crucial developments in human social organization and demonstrate the remarkable capacity of traditional cultures to reinvent themselves when circumstances require fundamental adaptation. The commercial networks that sustained these urban innovations extended far beyond the immediate regions where they emerged, creating trade relationships that connected the transforming Scythian territories with distant markets across Eurasia. Merchants who had learned to navigate the complex cultural landscape of the transitional steppes carried not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that enriched communities thousands of miles from their origins. These commercial connections often proved more durable than the political structures that had originally created them, continuing to operate effectively even as traditional forms of authority evolved or disappeared entirely. The luxury goods that flowed through these networks reflect the sophisticated tastes that had developed among the emerging elites of transitional Scythian society. While golden objects remained highly prized, new categories of prestigious items emerged that reflected changing cultural values and aesthetic preferences. Elaborate textiles woven with complex patterns, carved ivory objects depicting mythological scenes, and ceremonial weapons decorated with intricate inlays all found eager markets among communities that were redefining their relationship with material wealth and social status. The technological knowledge that accompanied these commercial exchanges facilitated rapid improvements in manufacturing techniques across vast geographical areas. Innovations developed in one region could spread through trade networks to influence production methods in distant territories within remarkably short periods. This technological diffusion often accelerated the pace of cultural change and created new opportunities for communities willing to adopt foreign techniques while adapting them to local conditions and requirements. The linguistic evidence from this period reveals the extent to which commercial activities facilitated communication between diverse cultural groups. Trade languages emerged that combined vocabulary from multiple sources, creating standardized communication systems that allowed merchants and craftsmen to conduct business effectively despite significant cultural differences. These commercial dialects often influenced the development of local languages and contributed to the emergence of shared cultural concepts across broad geographical regions. The financial innovations that emerged to support these expanding commercial networks demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of economic relationships that had developed within transforming Scythian society. Systems for extending credit, managing risk, and facilitating long-distance payments were developed that rivaled those used by established commercial civilizations. These financial techniques often proved so effective that they were subsequently adopted by neighboring communities and influenced economic development throughout the region. The quality control mechanisms that governed production for these expanded markets reflect the competitive pressures that accompanied commercial growth. Craftsmen were forced to meet increasingly demanding standards for both technical quality and aesthetic appeal, leading to continuous improvements in manufacturing techniques and artistic sophistication. These quality improvements often benefited local consumers as well as distant markets, raising living standards across participating communities. The transportation innovations that supported these commercial networks required solutions to logistical challenges that had never previously been addressed on such a scale. New types of vehicles were developed that could carry larger loads across difficult terrain, while organizational systems were created that could coordinate the movement of goods across vast distances. These transportation improvements often had broader social benefits beyond their commercial applications. The information systems that accompanied commercial expansion facilitated the rapid transmission of news and knowledge across the trade networks. Merchants served as informal communication channels that connected distant communities and allowed them to respond quickly to opportunities or threats. This information flow often proved crucial for maintaining social and political stability during periods of rapid change. The legal frameworks that governed these expanding commercial relationships had to address increasingly complex disputes and contractual arrangements. New forms of commercial law emerged that could handle transactions involving multiple jurisdictions and cultural systems, while arbitration mechanisms were developed that could resolve conflicts fairly and efficiently. These legal innovations often influenced broader developments in jurisprudence and governance. The cultural exchange that accompanied commercial expansion created new forms of artistic and intellectual synthesis that enriched all participating communities. Artists and craftsmen, working for expanded markets, had to develop aesthetic approaches that could appeal to diverse cultural sensibilities while maintaining distinctive characteristics that preserved their commercial value. This creative challenge often produced innovative works that achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication and influence. The educational requirements created by expanding commercial networks led to the development of new approaches to training and skill transmission. Young people needed to acquire knowledge about distant markets, foreign customs, and complex business practices that went far beyond traditional nomadic education. These educational innovations often had broader social benefits beyond their immediate commercial applications. The diplomatic implications of expanded commercial relationships required new approaches to international relations that emphasized mutual benefit rather than traditional dominance relationships. Trading communities needed to maintain peaceful relationships with diverse political entities while also protecting their commercial interests. These diplomatic innovations often provided models for interstate relationships that influenced political development throughout the region. The environmental impacts of intensified commercial activity required new approaches to resource management and conservation. Communities needed to balance the economic benefits of expanded trade with the need to maintain the ecological foundations that supported their long-term prosperity. These environmental challenges often stimulated innovations in resource management that had broader applications beyond their immediate commercial contexts. The social stratification that accompanied commercial expansion created new forms of inequality and social tension that required careful management. Successful merchants and craftsmen accumulated wealth and influence that challenged traditional authority structures, while those unable to participate in the new economy often found themselves marginalized. These social dynamics required innovative approaches to community organization and conflict resolution. The religious adaptations that accompanied commercial expansion reflect the spiritual dimensions of cultural transformation and the challenges of maintaining traditional beliefs while engaging with diverse cultural influences. New forms of religious practice emerged that could accommodate the spiritual needs of communities involved in complex commercial relationships while preserving essential cultural characteristics. These religious innovations often influenced spiritual development across much broader geographical areas. The architectural developments that supported expanding commercial activities required new approaches to urban planning and construction that could accommodate the increased complexity of transitional societies. Buildings needed to serve multiple functions, while also reflecting the cultural values and aesthetic preferences of diverse populations. These architectural innovations often influenced building practices throughout the region and provided models for subsequent urban development. The technological integration that resulted from expanded commercial relationships created new opportunities for innovation and problem-solving that benefited communities far beyond their immediate commercial contexts. Techniques developed to address specific commercial challenges often proved applicable to other problems and contributed to broader improvements in quality of life and productive capacity. The demographic changes that accompanied commercial expansion created new patterns of settlement and population movement that reshaped the cultural landscape of the transitional territories. Successful commercial centers attracted residents from diverse backgrounds, creating cosmopolitan communities that served as focal points for cultural exchange and innovation. These demographic developments often had lasting influences on regional development patterns. The military implications of expanded commercial networks required new approaches to security and defense that could protect valuable trade routes while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective military action. Defense forces needed to be capable of coordinating their activities across vast distances while also responding effectively to diverse types of threats. These military innovations often influenced tactical development throughout the region. The administrative systems that governed expanding commercial activities required new approaches to record-keeping, taxation, and regulation that could handle the increased complexity of transitional economies. Bureaucratic innovations were developed that could efficiently manage diverse types of commercial relationships, while also ensuring fair treatment for all participants. These administrative innovations often influenced governmental development throughout the region. At Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that these commercial developments represent crucial stages in the evolution of human economic organization and demonstrate the remarkable capacity of traditional societies to adapt their practices to meet new challenges while maintaining essential cultural characteristics. The seasonal rhythms that continue to govern much of Scythian life even during this period of transformation demonstrate the persistence of fundamental cultural patterns despite significant social and economic changes. The annual cycles of migration, breeding, and trading that had structured nomadic existence for millennia remained central to community organization, though they were increasingly modified to accommodate new economic opportunities and political requirements. These seasonal patterns provided stability and continuity during periods of rapid change, while also creating frameworks within which innovation could occur safely. The festival calendar that marked these seasonal transitions evolved to incorporate new elements while maintaining traditional significance. Celebrations that had once focused primarily on pastoral concerns began to include commercial activities and urban crafts, creating hybrid festivities that served the needs of increasingly diverse communities. These evolved celebrations often became important occasions for cultural exchange and political negotiation, serving functions that extended far beyond their original religious and social purposes. The migration patterns that continued to characterize much of Scythian society during this transitional period required constant adaptation to changing political and environmental conditions. Traditional routes between seasonal pastures had to be modified to accommodate new territorial arrangements and security concerns, while the timing of movements was adjusted to take advantage of commercial opportunities. These adaptive modifications often required complex negotiations between different community groups and demonstrated the sophisticated organizational capabilities that nomadic societies had developed. The animal husbandry practices that remained central to Scythian identity underwent significant refinement during this period as communities sought to maximize productivity while adapting to changed circumstances. New breeding programs were developed that emphasized characteristics valuable for both traditional pastoral uses and emerging commercial markets, while feeding and management techniques were improved to maintain herd health under increasingly challenging conditions. These innovations often proved so successful that they influenced livestock management practices throughout the region. The craft production that had always supplemented pastoral activities expanded significantly during this transitional period as communities sought to diversify their economic activities and reduce dependence on environmental variables. Traditional skills in metalworking, textile production, and leather crafting were refined and specialized to meet the demands of expanding markets, while new techniques were developed that incorporated influences from neighboring cultural traditions. These craft innovations often created new sources of wealth and social prestige that complemented traditional pastoral achievements. The storytelling traditions that preserved Scythian cultural memory evolved to incorporate new historical experiences while maintaining essential cultural values and identity markers. Traditional narratives were modified to address contemporary concerns and challenges, while new stories emerged that helped communities understand and cope with the changes they were experiencing. These narrative adaptations often provided crucial psychological and social support during periods of uncertainty and transformation. The leadership structures that had governed traditional Scythian society underwent significant evolution as new types of expertise became crucial for community survival and prosperity. Traditional warrior elites found themselves sharing authority with individuals who possessed specialized knowledge about commerce, agriculture, or diplomacy, creating more complex and diverse leadership groups. These evolutionary changes in governance often required careful negotiation to maintain social cohesion while adapting to new circumstances. The marriage and kinship systems that had traditionally organized Scythian social relationships adapted to accommodate the increased complexity and diversity of transitional communities. Traditional clan-based marriage patterns were supplemented with new types of alliances that reflected commercial partnerships or political agreements, while kinship terminology evolved to address new types of relationships. These social innovations often facilitated the integration of diverse populations while maintaining essential cultural continuity. The conflict resolution mechanisms that had maintained peace within traditional Scythian communities were modified to address new types of disputes that arose from commercial activities and cultural mixing. Traditional approaches based on clan authority and customary law were supplemented with new procedures that could handle conflicts between individuals from different cultural backgrounds or involving unfamiliar types of relationships. These legal innovations often provided models that influenced dispute resolution practices throughout the region. The educational approaches that prepared young people for adult roles in transitional Scythian society had to balance traditional cultural transmission with preparation for new economic and social realities. Traditional apprenticeship methods were expanded to include training in commercial practices and intercultural communication, while new forms of formal education emerged to address specialized knowledge requirements. These educational innovations often created new pathways for social mobility while preserving essential cultural knowledge. The medical practices that maintained community health evolved to address new challenges created by changed living conditions and increased cultural contact. Traditional healing techniques were supplemented with medical knowledge borrowed from neighboring cultures, while new treatments were developed to address health problems that emerged from altered lifestyles. These medical innovations often proved beneficial for communities far beyond their original contexts. The artistic patronage that supported cultural production during this transitional period reflected the changing sources of wealth and authority within Scythian society. New elite groups with different aesthetic preferences and cultural values began commissioning works that reflected their particular interests and identities, creating demand for artistic innovations that could serve diverse patrons. These patronage changes often stimulated creativity and led to the development of new artistic styles and techniques. The religious authority that had traditionally guided spiritual life within Scythian communities adapted to serve the needs of increasingly diverse and complex societies. Traditional shamanic roles were supplemented with new types of religious specialization that could address the spiritual challenges of cultural transformation, while religious institutions evolved to serve communities with diverse cultural backgrounds. These religious adaptations often facilitated social integration while preserving essential spiritual traditions. The technological knowledge that had been accumulated through generations of nomadic life was systematically preserved and transmitted during this period of rapid change. Traditional techniques for working metals, preparing foods, and managing animals were documented and taught to ensure their survival, while new technologies were carefully evaluated and adapted to complement existing knowledge systems. These preservation efforts often ensured that valuable cultural knowledge would survive periods of social disruption. The diplomatic skills that had been developed through centuries of intercultural contact were refined and expanded to address the complex international relationships that characterized the transitional period. Traditional approaches to negotiation and alliance building were supplemented with new techniques appropriate for dealing with settled civilizations and complex political entities. These diplomatic innovations often provided models that influenced interstate relationships throughout the region. The military traditions that had made Scythian warriors legendary continued to evolve during this period of transformation, adapting to new strategic challenges while maintaining essential tactical advantages. Traditional cavalry techniques were modified to address new types of warfare and defensive requirements, while organizational methods were developed that could coordinate diverse military forces effectively. These military innovations often influenced tactical development across much broader geographical areas. The economic knowledge that had been accumulated through generations of pastoral and commercial activity was systematically applied to address the challenges of transitional societies. traditional understanding of resource management and trade relationships was expanded to encompass new types of economic activities and market relationships, while innovative approaches were developed to address unprecedented challenges. These economic innovations often provided models that influenced commercial development throughout the region. The social integration mechanisms that had traditionally maintained cohesion within Scythian communities were adapted to serve increasingly diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds and economic interests. Traditional approaches based on kinship and clan membership were supplemented with new forms of social organization that could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining community solidarity. These social innovations often proved so successful that they were adopted by neighboring communities facing similar challenges. The cultural preservation efforts that were undertaken during this period of rapid change demonstrate the conscious recognition of the value of traditional knowledge and practices. Formal mechanisms were established to ensure that important cultural information would be transmitted to future generations, while archives and repositories were created to preserve materials that might otherwise be lost. These preservation efforts often ensured that essential cultural knowledge would survive periods of social transformation. The environmental management practices that had been developed through generations of steppe life were applied to address new challenges created by changing settlement patterns and economic activities. Traditional knowledge about resource conservation and ecological balance was adapted to serve communities with different lifestyles and economic needs, while new approaches were developed to address unprecedented environmental challenges. These environmental innovations often influenced resource management practices throughout the region. At Obscure Historiesa, we understand that these adaptive strategies represent fundamental aspects of human cultural resilience and demonstrate the remarkable capacity of traditional societies to reinvent themselves while preserving essential characteristics that define their identity and ensure their continued survival. The documentation preserved in classical sources reveals the complex web of alliances and conflicts that characterize the final centuries of Scythian political influence across the western steppes. Roman historians of the imperial period, writing from the perspective of an empire that had inherited many of the territories once dominated by nomadic confederations, provide fascinating accounts of how the legacy of Scythian military innovations continued to influence warfare long after their political mentored beyond structures had fragged recognition. These later observers noted the persistent influence of Scythian tactical approaches in the military practices of successor peoples who had inherited their territories and adapted their methods. The mounted archery techniques that had once terrorized Persian armies found new expression in the hands of Sarmatian warriors who combined traditional steppe mobility with innovations in armor and weaponry that reflected centuries of tactical evolution. These military adaptations created hybrid fighting styles that proved remarkably effective against both nomadic rivals and settled opponents. The transformation of religious practices during these final centuries reveals the spiritual dimensions of cultural adaptation and the mechanisms through which traditional belief systems could maintain relevance while serving increasingly diverse communities. Sacred sites that had once served purely nomadic populations were modified to accommodate new ritual requirements, while traditional ceremonies were expanded to address the spiritual needs of settled populations who had adopted Scythian cultural elements while maintaining their own distinct identities. The archaeological evidence from this later period shows increasing sophistication in manufacturing techniques and artistic expression, suggesting that cultural decline in political terms did not necessarily translate to decline in creative or technological capabilities. Craftsmen working in former Scythian territories continued to produce objects of extraordinary beauty and technical complexity, often combining traditional animal-style motifs with influences drawn from across the ancient world. These artistic syntheses created new aesthetic traditions that would influence decorative arts across Eurasia for centuries to come. The linguistic traces that survive from this period provide tantalizing glimpses into the process of cultural transmission and adaptation. vocabulary related to horse breeding, metalworking, and nomadic social organization entered the languages of settled peoples across a vast geographical range, creating shared terminology that reflected the practical influence of Scythian knowledge systems. These linguistic borrowings often preserved technical concepts and cultural practices long after the political entities that had originally developed them had ceased to exist. The urban settlements that emerged in former Scythian territories during this period represent fascinating experiments in cultural synthesis and social organization. These communities often combined architectural elements drawn from multiple traditions, creating distinctive building styles that reflected both nomadic spatial concepts and the practical requirements of permanent settlement. The success of these urban experiments demonstrates the adaptability of cultural traditions and their capacity to serve new functions while maintaining essential characteristics. The commercial networks that had sustained Scythian prosperity evolved to serve new political realities while maintaining many of the operational principles that had made them effective. Merchants who had learned to navigate the complex cultural landscape of the steppes adapted their techniques to serve emerging political entities, often becoming crucial intermediaries in relationships between nomadic and settled populations. These commercial adaptations ensured the continuation of profitable trade relationships despite fundamental changes in political organization. The military fortifications that appeared across former Scythian territories reflect the changing strategic requirements of communities adapting to new security challenges. These defensive works often incorporated both traditional steppe warfare considerations and techniques borrowed from settled civilizations, creating hybrid defensive systems that could address diverse types of threats. The engineering sophistication displayed in these fortifications demonstrates the continued innovation capacity of communities descended from nomadic traditions. The religious syncretism that characterized this period created new forms of spiritual expression that served diverse populations while maintaining connections to traditional belief systems. Sacred spaces were designed to accommodate multiple religious traditions simultaneously, creating hybrid ceremonial environments that reflected the complex cultural negotiations required for successful community integration. These religious innovations often provided models for spiritual accommodation that influenced religious development across much broader geographical areas. The technological workshops that operated in these transitional communities facilitated continued innovation in metallurgy, textile production, and other specialized crafts. The concentration of skilled artisans from diverse cultural backgrounds created ideal conditions for technical development and artistic experimentation, leading to innovations that often surpassed the achievements of their individual cultural components. These technological advances frequently found applications far beyond their original contexts and influenced manufacturing practices across vast geographical regions. The educational institutions that emerged to serve these complex communities had to address unprecedented challenges in cultural transmission and skill development. Traditional apprenticeship methods were supplemented with formal schools that could provide instruction in multiple cultural traditions simultaneously, while libraries and archives were established to preserve important knowledge for future reference. These educational innovations often created new opportunities for social mobility while ensuring the preservation of essential cultural knowledge. The legal systems that governed these diverse communities required sophisticated approaches to jurisprudence that could accommodate multiple cultural traditions and types of social relationships. Hybrid legal codes emerged that combined elements from nomadic customary law with principles borrowed from settled civilizations, creating flexible frameworks that could address complex disputes fairly and efficiently. These legal innovations often provided models that influenced juridical development throughout the region. The diplomatic practices that characterized relationships between these transitional communities and their neighbors demonstrate the continued sophistication of political leadership descended from Scythian traditions. New approaches to treaty-making and alliance-building emerged that emphasized cultural accommodation and mutual benefit, while traditional ceremonies were modified to serve new diplomatic requirements. These diplomatic innovations often secured favorable terms for communities despite their changed circumstances. The demographic patterns that emerged during this period reflect the complex population movements that accompanied cultural transformation. Migration streams carried people with Scythian cultural heritage to distant territories, where they often became founding populations for new communities, while immigration brought individuals from diverse backgrounds into former Scythian territories. These population movements created networks of related communities that maintained cultural connections across vast distances. The economic specialization that developed in these communities created new forms of regional interdependence that often proved more resilient than traditional political relationships. Different settlements specialized in particular types of production or services, creating commercial networks that could operate effectively despite political instability. These economic relationships often provided stability and continuity during periods of rapid political change. The environmental management practices that were implemented in these transitional communities demonstrate the application of accumulated nomadic knowledge to new settlement contexts. Traditional understanding of ecological relationships was adapted to serve permanent communities, while new approaches were developed to address environmental challenges created by concentrated settlement. These environmental innovations often influenced resource management practices throughout the region. The social integration mechanisms that operated in these diverse communities reveal the processes through which different cultural traditions could be successfully combined into functioning societies. Cultural festivals, commercial activities, and religious ceremonies provided opportunities for different groups to interact and develop shared identities, while institutional frameworks ensured that conflicts could be resolved peacefully. These integration mechanisms often proved so successful that they were adopted by other communities facing similar demographic challenges. The artistic patronage that supported cultural production in these communities reflected the emergence of new elite groups whose wealth derived from diverse sources and whose aesthetic preferences combined multiple cultural influences. Commissioning practices evolved to serve patrons with complex cultural identities, leading to the development of new artistic styles that could appeal to diverse audiences while maintaining distinctive characteristics. These artistic innovations often achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication and influence. The technological diffusion that occurred through these transitional communities facilitated the rapid spread of innovations across cultural boundaries. Techniques developed to address specific local challenges often proved applicable to similar problems in distant regions, while the concentration of diverse technical traditions created ideal conditions for innovation and improvement. These technological developments often had impacts that extended far beyond their original contexts. The religious authority that guided spiritual life in these communities had to address the complex needs of populations with diverse cultural backgrounds and spiritual traditions. New forms of religious leadership emerged that could serve multiple constituencies simultaneously, while ceremonial practices were developed that could accommodate different belief systems within unified community celebrations. These religious adaptations often facilitated social cohesion while preserving essential spiritual traditions. At Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that these final transformations of Scythian culture represent crucial developments in human social organization and demonstrate the remarkable capacity of traditional societies to adapt and evolve while maintaining essential characteristics that preserve their distinctive contributions to human civilization. The Scythians ultimately represent one of history's most compelling demonstrations of how nomadic peoples could achieve levels of cultural sophistication that rivaled any settled civilization. Their mastery of mounted warfare revolutionized ancient military tactics. Their artistic achievements created aesthetic traditions that influenced cultures across Eurasia for millennia, and their flexible political systems provided models for governing vast territories, while maintaining essential cultural characteristics. Through their interactions with Greek colonies, Persian empires, and countless other peoples, The Scythians proved that the boundaries between civilized and barbarian were far more fluid than ancient writers typically acknowledged. Their legacy endures not only in the spectacular golden artifacts that continue to emerge from steppe burial mounds, but in the fundamental ways they transformed our understanding of what nomadic societies could accomplish when circumstances allowed their remarkable talents to flourish. As we have seen throughout this exploration, the Scythians were far more than the nomadic barbarians that ancient settled civilizations often portrayed them to be. They were the architects of a sophisticated culture that spanned continents and centuries. Master innovators whose contributions to warfare, art, and social organization would echo through history long after their political confederation had faded into memory. Their golden artifacts speak to us across millennia, not merely as displays of wealth, but as testament to a people who understood that true civilization could flourish on horseback just as surely as within city walls. The legacy of the Scythians challenges us to reconsider our most fundamental assumptions about human achievement and cultural development. They demonstrated that nomadic peoples could create complex political systems, produce artistic masterpieces that rival any ancient civilization, and develop military innovations that would influence warfare for over 1,000 years. From their revolutionary mounted archery techniques to their sophisticated animal art style, from their flexible political confederations to their remarkable ability to adapt and transform while maintaining their essential identity, the Scythians proved that the steppes could nurture civilizations every bit as remarkable as those that arose in river valleys and coastal plains. Perhaps most importantly, the Scythians remind us that human ingenuity and cultural achievement take many forms. Their story is one of adaptation, innovation, and resilience in the face of changing circumstances. Even as their political power waned and their territories were inherited by successor peoples, their influence continued to shape the cultures that followed them, creating a lasting impact that extends far beyond their immediate historical moment. The thundering hooves that once carried Scythian warriors across the endless grasslands have long since fallen silent, but their echo continues to resonate through the corridors of history, reminding us that some of humanity's greatest achievements have emerged not from the marble halls of cities, but from the boundless horizons of the steppes themselves.